Karoline Leavitt and Richard Wolff face off in a battle of narratives, power, policy, and the public's trust on the line. Subscribe now for the latest stories because this one's just getting started. The studio was thick with an electric stillness, the kind that hums in the air like a charged storm cloud. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the polished mahogany table. Cameras loomed like silent sentinels, their lenses glinting as they caught every flicker of tension. The audience, a sea of faces leaning in, held their breath. The stakes were clear. The truth of a crumbling economy, the weight of a nation's expectations, and the confrontation between a high-profile voice of authority and a relentless analyst of systems. Karoline Leavitt adjusted her blazer, the fabric brushing against her skin like a quiet promise. Her confidence was iron, forged in the heat of the White House press room, where every word was a calculated strike. She knew the script already. It would be her to wield the narrative, to bend the room toward her controlled cadence. Across from her, Richard Wolff sat with his hands folded, a chess player studying the board. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, dissected her unspoken gestures, her readiness, her belief that she held the upper hand. He had seen this before, the certainty of officials, the glint of a press secretary's righteousness. But he also knew his own numbers, his own insights could unravel the illusion of control. The air between them crackled not with sound, but with the weight of what was to come. Karoline's voice cut through the silence, low and deliberate like the first tremor of a quake before the ruin begins. You know, Richard, I've spent years watching people like you, AI***s in academic robes, translating inflation into dry speeches, while real families lose jobs, homes, and hope. I've stood in those press rooms, felt the pressure of 1,000 questions, and I've fought to make sure every American understood the truth their government was telling. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping the table in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The anecdote was vivid, the sensory details raw. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, the fluorescent buzz, the way the crowd's murmurs felt like static to her. Her voice held the edge of a person who had seen too much, who had turned chaos into clarity with every press release. Wolff's lips curved faintly, a predator recognizing a prey in the open. That's a moving story, Karoline, he said, his voice smooth as a river carving through stone. But let's look at the numbers, shall we? Last quarter, the employment rate dropped 0.6%, a figure that doesn't scream victory like your anecdotes might. And did I mention the trade deficit? It's now at $1.2 trillion, a record high. You're not just telling stories, you're painting over a canvas that's already stained. His fingers uncurled, revealing a folder brimming with reports. The audience shifted, their curiosity sharpening. Leavitt's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Numbers are useful, she said, her tone measured. But they're not the whole story. When people hear a deficit, they don't see a spreadsheet, they see a collapsing dollar, a bank account drained, a life unspooling. She paused, her gaze hardening. I've been in those rooms, Richard. I've seen the fear in their eyes. When your policy summaries fail to capture that fear, you're not just wrong, you're complicit. Wolff's eyes narrowed, not in anger but calculation. Complicit. That's a strong word, he said, his voice calm. I've spent 30 years in economics peeling back layers of systemic inequities. I saw the 2008 crash up close, the way regulations were gutted in the name of free markets. You can gloss over that with a smile and a press release, but the system is still broken. He leaned in, his voice soft but steady. I've lost friends to that collapse, people I trusted because they believed in the same ideals as you. Leavitt's jaw tightened. You're using grief as a weapon, she said, her voice low. But real grief is what happens when a family gets evicted, when a community watches its schools close, when people are told they can't afford health care. You think your numbers fix that? They don't, they just make it harder to understand. Her hands curled into fists, her nails pressing into her palms as if holding onto something solid. Wolff shifted, his shoulders relaxing as he leaned back. Understanding is the first step, he said. But let's talk about the second, action. Last year I worked with farmers in Kansas who were drowning in debt. Their income per acre dropped by 22% when corporate policies shifted. Your administration's tax reforms, crafted in Washington, not on a farm, left them high and dry. He tapped the folder, a quiet reminder of the data. You can argue until you're blue in the face, but the collapse doesn't care if you're using metaphors or spreadsheets. Leavitt's voice rose like a tempest. You think I don't understand the human cost? I've spent my life defending the truth, even when it SLICE Chinese letter knife through the establishment. The noise in this room isn't from my job, it's from the world pressing in, demanding accountability. I've faced down people who wanted to rewrite history and I've never backed down. She paused, her words lingering like smoke. You're a man who's lived in ivory towers, Richard. I've walked the streets of a country that's watching you and me determine its fate. Wolff's expression never wavered, but his eyes held a quiet fire. Clarity comes from truth, not from control. I've seen what happens when truth is buried under press releases. People lose trust, and when they lose trust, they lose faith in the system. You can call it a crosshairs, Karoline, but you're the one standing in the center, surrounded by lies the public is forced to swallow. He straightened, his tone shifting to something colder. I've been fighting for decades to peel back that curtain, and I won't stop now no matter how high you raise the stakes. The silence that followed was like a held breath. The cameras caught the moment, the flicker of Leavitt's gaze, the slow breath Wolff took as he prepared to speak. The room was no longer an audience but a battleground, each seat a witness to the clash of ideals. What started as a casual debate had turned into something sharper, something more urgent. The truth, it seemed, was not just a matter of policy but of survival. Leavitt's voice broke the stillness, low and steady. If the truth is so urgent, Richard, then why did you disappear from the public eye for 5 years after your last big speech? Why did you vanish when the world was watching? Her hands rested on the table, fingers splayed like a person testing the ground. The metaphor here is clear. Truth, when unmoored, can feel unstable. Wolff's lips pressed into a thin line. Disappeared, that's your spin. I spent those years working, replying the articles, shaping arguments, gathering data that would prove the system wasn't broken, it was engineered. You think I don't know what your press releases do? They scatter the public like breadcrumbs, leading them to the trail you choose. I've seen the power of pre-packaged narratives, Karoline, I've fought them. His voice dipped, the rhythm lulling the room. And I'll fight them again. Leavitt's shoulders squared, her voice rising. You think I chose fear? I chose the truth. I've stood in press rooms where people screamed that I was lying, where I was called a puppet. But my job isn't about popularity, it's about the public's right to know. You'd rather let them choke on misinformation than give them the full picture. That's the real engine of collapse, not policies, but your refusal to confront reality. Wolff's laugh was a dry rasp. Reality? I've spent my life confronting reality, Karoline. In 2012, I filled a lecture hall with over 2,000 people who had no idea their pensions were being siphoned into offshore accounts. I've stood next to teachers who had to take second jobs to pay for their classrooms. Reality isn't a press secretary's script, it's the weight of a real economy, the merciless math of a country bleeding from its seams. And I've seen how your administration's truth has been nothing but a bandage over a wound that keeps reopening. The audience leaned in, the silence thickening like a fog. Leavitt's expression hardened, the old lines of her face etching themselves deeper. You want to talk about wounds? I've spent time in rooms where people were screaming for accountability, where I had to deliver the truth even when it cut through them. You tout your lectures and your reports, but even those are just words in a void. I don't have that luxury, I have to speak in a way that shakes the world. Wolff's eyes burned. Shakes the world or bends it to your will. I've seen how your rhetoric has been used to justify austerity. How your truth has led to cuts in programs that support the very people you claim to protect. You can't wave a press release and call it a victory, Karoline. That's not leadership, it's boxing people into a corner and calling it choice. Leavitt's voice was a blade, sharp and unyielding. You think I don't see the corners I'm pushing people into? I have to be their voice when the rest of the world refuses to listen. I don't have the luxury of waiting for academia to catch up with reality. I have to act now. Wolff's gaze never wavered. Act or deflect, that's your pattern, isn't it? Turn every crisis into a headline, every complex system into a villain. But what happens when the headlines don't align with the numbers you're ignoring? His voice rose slightly, a challenge. What happens when the world stops listening to you? The room seemed to hold its breath. The cameras caught the flicker of Leavitt's jaw, the way her fingers curled into fists. The metaphor of the fog, the storm, the siege, each one echoing the tension of the moment. The truth, it seemed, was no longer a question of who was right but who would bear the cost of silence. And then, the floor creaked. A beat of silence. The question, Wolff murmured, is who will pay the price when the music stops. Leavitt's eyes locked onto his and the audience felt the weight of it. The battle had shifted from policy to legacy, from logic to the scars hidden beneath both their arguments. But there was no time to breathe before the next salvo.